Alfred Hitchcock, one of the greatest directors, the so-called proclaimed master of suspense, known for directing some of the most thrilling and most engaging thrillers of his time, if not of all time. Hitchcock movies hold up because even though his films are made with the sensibilities of the past, they remain incredibly engaging, and the concept of the man-on-the-run thriller continues to be a relevant idea. Like many filmmakers of his era, Hitchcock made so many movies. Some of these, like Psycho and Vertigo, are considered classics, revered as some of the greatest movies ever. Then there are the movies that don't seem to get as much love or attention. If they do get brought up, it's generally within a larger body of Hitchcock's work, as opposed to being referenced among his best movies. That's what we're here to rectify. With this video, I'm going to count down 10 Hitchcock films that I feel like don't get enough appreciation and are worthy of your time. But first, remember to subscribe and hit that like button. Also, check out my website at danzen.net. Anyway, let's buckle up, because I'm pretty sure I've been accused of a crime I did not commit. Released in 1950, and based on the first novel in the Eve Guild book series by Selin Jepson, Stage Fright was made during a period where Hitchcock decided to return to the UK again. The movie sees Hitchcock going back to the more limited, low-budget murder mystery route. Jane Wyman stars as Eve Gill, an aspiring actress at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London. In classic Hitchcock fashion, Eve finds herself enlisted to help a young male friend who has been accused of murdering the husband of a glamorous entertainer he's been having an affair with, played by Marlene Dietrich. Stage Fright has a lot of things going against it that make people think of it as top-tier Hitchcock. It's more of a straightforward, self-contained mystery, made on a budget and limited to several low sets. But that's what I think I like about Stage Fright. Out of all the films he's made since calling Hollywood home, it's the feature that recalls the feel of his older British films the most. I think it also represents a thing that Hitch does best, and actually did very rarely in his career: classic murder mystery intrigue. It's a genuine puzzler, not a man-on-the-run thriller, but a sleuthing case, complete with disguises and suspects. Just like in The Lady Vanishes, there are a pair of detectives that are following our main characters. Hitchcock opens establishing that the mystery has already happened, and in flashbacks reveals to the audience how the main characters got to the place where they are. Much of the film is stage-bound, set in and around locations that are theater-based. It is a jokingly metatextual commentary on the art of acting. Eve's entire charade of trying to pass herself off as Doris the maid is presented as comically inept, to the point where everyone can tell it's her. In most Hitchcock movies, he likes to point out who the culprit is almost immediately. In Stage Fright, there is a genuine whodunit to follow. Hitchcock does give us some obvious clues and hints, but it's all in service of a big climax reveal featuring a false narrative technique at the end. Hitchcock wanted to change the ending because he was worried that people might misinterpret his intentions. But here through the film building things up, it's used to an incredibly strong effect. Lead Jane Wyman, who got top billing, felt neglected on set, believing that Marlene Dietrich was taking away all the spotlight from her. But I mean, it's Marlene Dietrich. Even she didn't have a clear seeming contractual obligation to look as flattering as possible. If you're going to have her in your movie, you might as well use her. The movie gives her several songs, and basically half the time she shows up on screen, she's in some kind of glamorous pose. She also gets many of the film's best moments, and her witty insults are extremely funny.
Don't confide in me, just pour some tea, would you?
For my money though, the real MVP of the film is Alistair Sim as Eve's know-it-all father, who's an absolute hoot. The only thing worrying against Stage Fright, and the reason it's only number 10 on this list, is that much like those UK films, it feels very cheap, and a little less polished than you might expect from a Hitchcock film, even stagey you might say. However, a smaller budget should never be a deterrent against enjoying a film. This is definitely one murder mystery that proves the age-old adage, all the world's a hitch. Released in 1941, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which no, is not about spies, stars Carol Lombard and Robert Montgomery as Anne and David Smith, a couple who finds out their marriage is not valid. They end up separating, but through a series of mishaps, and David's own reluctance to give up the relationship, keep running into each other in various comedic situations. Hitchcock's only straightforward studio comedy. Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a movie that is easy to write off as the master's most anonymous post-Hollywood feature. Upon rewatch though, Mr. and Mrs. Smith is not a movie without its charms. It's a very typical 40s screwball romantic comedy, but I think a lot of the movie works, as does any film in the genre, because of the chemistry of its leads. There are conflicting reports about why Hitchcock got involved with Mr. and Mrs. Smith. In interviews, he said he only did it as a favor to Carole Lombard, because she rented out a house for him, while other reports suggest he pursued the project himself. Whatever the case, the genesis of the film goes back to Lombard. Hitchcock was interested in working with her, initially on a dramatic project, before deciding that he would like to direct a pure comedy in the American landscapes, with what he described as typical Americans. Hitchcock himself was not particularly fond of the final product. In his own words, "I really didn't understand the type of people who were portrayed in the film. All I did was photograph the scenes as written, thinking of it as more of a workman-like job that he had little control over. He directed the Norman Krasden script as straightforwardly as possible, adding in very little flourishes of his own. In later years, he would describe the film as one of his worst." It's very telling how much of a journeyman feel this has compared to the rest of Hitchcock's oeuvre. The only sequence in the entire feature that really feels Hitchcock-like is an extended bit involving a Ferris wheel breaking down. Otherwise, a lot of his absurd heightened comedic situations where characters put themselves through screwball-type scenarios, just to be close to the other. It's the sort of comedic moments that I enjoy about the film. The movie is written in such a way that it is broken up from two different perspectives, and then everything ties together at the end. Initially, the movie seemed to be entirely from Robert Montgomery, David Smith's perspective, and this was a big worry as I was watching the movie. Montgomery is very solid as David Smith, and even has a few good moments of slapstick-type physical comedy, including faking his own sickness and accidentally getting his nose bruised at one point. But a lot of times, the David parts can get a little repetitive. In a classic Hollywood sort of way, he comes off as a desperate man who refuses to give up on a relationship that is obviously over. There are scenes of him and his guy friends in a sauna, and it gets a little old after a while. It's the second part of the feature, where we get more of the perspective of Carole Lombard's Anne, and her relationship with a new man in her life, Jeff, where the movie really starts to pick up some steam. Carole Lombard was one of the greatest screwball comedians of her time, and she's wonderfully cold here. The way she goes full tilt angry towards Montgomery's David, pretending to act like she doesn't even know who he is, and then screaming at him to get out of the house, is some finely tuned delivered bits of dry comedy.
All right, we'll get married. Does that satisfy you?
We'll get married. That's a nice snarling proposal.
There are a lot of things in this film that are, in hindsight, unbelievable to imagine happening in a Hitchcock film. These include a rather ridiculous sequence where David sneaks into the back of a female clothes department store, a man getting a case of drunk hiccups, and a finale set at a ski lounge in the middle of winter, which involves David faking his own sickness so he can get close to his ex-partner. It is a very 1940s type of film, right down to his dated stance on the idea that a woman should crawl back to her ex, in spite of him basically acting like a creeper. The more and more I go through Alfred Hitchcock's filmography, these occasional early detours that he took on in his career, while not all of them entirely successful, are interesting to watch from the perspective of a filmmaker trying to work around the studio system of the time. As far as this list is concerned, it's a nice little moment of relief before the heavier stuff kicks in. Made a year before the U.S. officially entered the Second World War, Foreign Correspondent sees Alfred Hitchcock making a movie to appease the Allies abroad fighting for their lives. The movie stars Joel McCrea as crime reporter Johnny Jones, who is sent to Europe to report on conditions in the country, as the worry of an impending war is on the rise. Along the way, Jones discovers a conspiracy involving a disappearing Dutch diplomat named Van Meer and a group of mysterious spies that are up to no good. Producer Walter Wagner had bought the rights to the Vincent Shin political memoir, Personal History, based on his life as a journalist working in Europe and Asia in the 20s and 30s. He wanted to make it into a feature, updated to be more in line with the current war that was going on in Europe at the time. Hitchcock was more than ready to make this film as his follow-up to his American debut, Rebecca. While Rebecca was a melodrama, Foreign Correspondent, which calls back to some of his earlier, more adventurous British spy films, would represent the blueprint for the kind of motion picture that would wind up defining the master. If Foreign Correspondence was merely propaganda, it probably wouldn't be on here, as I would write it off as wartime nonsense. But this is a Hitchcock movie, so you know something big or bad is going to happen. Instead of making Foreign Correspondent into a straightforward narrative that was designed to make his fellow Europeans happy, Alfred Hitchcock made it into an Alfred Hitchcock picture, complete with espionage, double crossings, and his love of pursuits. To maintain the balance of the narrative, Hitchcock kept devising one big set piece after another. These include a sequence where Van Meer the diplomat appears to get murdered, a dangerous chase against an assassin in a windmill, and most impressively, a climax that involves a plane crash. This sequence for 1939, which was a very revolutionary set piece, was accomplished brilliantly using a rear projector. The crew used footage of a stunt plane driving towards the ocean, and then projected it on a rice paper screen. That water was then released, which smashed through the paper. Considering I still find this sequence exhilarating even by today's standards, just imagine what audiences in 1939 must have thought of it. Unusual for a Hitchcock movie of the time, several writers took a stab at the script, including humorist Robert Benchley, who wrote some of the film's wittiest dialogue. Much of the film's humor derives from the cultural differences between Americans and more upper-class type Europeans. Johnny doesn't understand the language of the Dutch, and the movie presents it in a very humorous, isn't he dumb sort of fashion.
Look. Man. Old Mill, understand? Well, does anyone here speak English?
Hitchcock was disappointed he didn't get to cast a more charismatic star in the lead role, but I think Joel McCrea works well as the everyman reporter. The romance between him and Lorraine Day's Carol Fisher, the daughter of the film's leader of the United Peace Party, played by Herbert Marshall, has a very romantic comedy screwball vibe. Even when they're talking about Europe fighting in the war, it feels like the two are bickering at each other as much as they're trying to push towards more negotiations. Some of the movie's best dialogue exchanges come from their interactions.
I can think of others.
Now, look, you've got to help me, not for my sake alone, but this is the biggest story in Europe.
Look, your childish mind is as out of place in Europe as you are in my bedroom.
The movie is still propaganda. It does end on a rather outdated radio broadcast, which is meant to help with the Allies fighting for their lives overseas, as the Star-Spangled Banner blatantly plays. But that doesn't make the movie bad either. It is above anything else a very fun 1940s globe-trotting espionage thriller. Also, it's hard for me to hate a movie where the main character is seen whistling his own theme music. From a film released before World War II to a film released during World War II, Saboteur sees Hitchcock doing a warm-up for his classic Man on the Run routine, but in a different setting and context. Robert Cummings stars as a factory worker, Barry Kane, who after being accused of sabotaging the death of one of his co-workers, finds himself being confronted by the authorities. In typical Hitchcock fashion, he becomes a fugitive of law, being sold out and then joining forces with niece of a blind man he took refugee with, Patricia Pat Martin, played by Priscilla Lane. If this premise feels like something you've heard before, it's because it's very similar to many Alfred Hitchcock movies, including most notably The 39 Steps before it, and North by Northwest after. Hitchcock conceived of Saboteur himself. He had the idea of a story involving a munitions worker who goes on the run to clear his name. When the U.S. entered World War II, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the premise is altered to make it more topically relevant for the day. The titular saboteurs become stand-in for rich Nazi sympathizers working to accomplish Hitler's evil goals. Their plot involves blowing up a battleship at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was Hitchcock's way through entertainment of reminding people to watch out for the enemies in hiding. Just like Foreign Correspondent, this is another Hitchcock movie that could also be read as propaganda for the time period it's in. Unlike Foreign Correspondent, though, this movie was not made with any real direct intention of being propaganda. It is just plain old wartime entertainment. There are 3 credited screenwriters on Saboteur. Joan Harrison worked with Hitchcock on the initial draft, Peter Vertil, who was brought in to rework the script, and then Dorothy Parker. Parker was responsible for adding a lot of the more overtly political elements, including the sequence that Hitchcock was the most proud of. It involves a group of refugee circus performers that Barry and Patricia are hiding out with for the night. They have a long, obvious conversation about fascism and what it means to be a good American. If Saboteur was merely World War II type propaganda, then it probably wouldn't be on this list. No, this movie is above all else just a great 40s pot-boiled thriller, with memorable supporting characters, some incredible shots of New York City, and a lot of sequences involving waterfalls and dams. This movie is one of the earliest examples of Hitchcock's distrust of authority. The police in the film are presented as untrustworthy and unconfident, while the older gentleman played by Otto Kruger turns out to be the ringmaster behind the entire Nazi-type operation. The character is introduced as a debonair, charismatic type, but is not so slyly implied to be far more sinister than he's led on to be. The only people who trust Barry's innocence are ordinary down-on-their-luck folks. The relationship between Robert Cummings Barry and Priscilla Lane's Pat goes from genuine spite, as Lane handcuffs herself to Cummings out of fear, to warming up to each other, and then romance. In the spirit of other Hitchcock blondes, Pat is very active and involved with the main story. In classic Hitchcock fashion, there are plenty of exciting suspenseful sequences. The film's most memorable moment is its climax set at the Statue of Liberty. Our hero Barry finds himself trying to rescue Fry, one of the film's saboteurs, and the man who framed him at the beginning, as he is dangling for his life. This would wind up being a more primitive rehearsal for what Hitchcock would do to even greater effect, and on a considerably much larger budget, with the Mount Rushmore set piece in North by Northwest. That's a good way of describing Saboteur. A lot of it is what you have seen from Hitchcock before. That doesn't make it any less noteworthy, though. This movie is a perfect representation of the type of film that Hitchcock excels best at. There's a reason he kept coming back to this formula. Also, fun fact, this is the only Alfred Hitchcock movie where the MacGuffin is a baby. Now beat that. Noteworthy is Shirley MacLaine's film debut, and based on a 1950 novel by Jack Trevor Story. The Trouble with Harry is Hitchcock's own take on the black absurdist comedy. It stars 5 inhabitants of a small Vermont town, who upon discovering a dead body, question what to do with it. Should they bury it, or will they get in trouble with the authorities? The possibilities are endless, and none of them appear to have a good ending. Shot on location in Craftsbury, Vermont, The Trouble with Harry stands as one of Hitchcock's most beautiful looking films, with its pastoral setting and gorgeous 1950s Technicolor cinematography from Robert Burks, that appropriately almost makes it look like it's a painting. It is one of the few Hollywood movies from the era to have the impeccable and distinct New England vibes. As well, The Trouble with Harry is another comedy from Hitchcock, but it's not a traditional comedy in the way Mr. and Mrs. Smith was. This is the exact kind of ridiculous situation that you might imagine the master would be more interested in bringing to the screen. The premise is centered around the idea of a dead body, and the movie proves that even when he's doing a comedy, Hitchcock can't help but start out the film with his typical trademark wrongfully accused man trope. In this case, it's Edmund Gwen's drunken Captain Albert Wilkes, who claims that he may have been the one to fire the bullet in the opening shot that killed Harry. As the story progresses, it becomes clear more than one person in the town believes they had a reason for killing the man, whether it was because they were married to him and having marital issues, or they hit him with their hiking boots by accident. There's a sense of gentleness that comes to the movie's comedy, a situation built around the tension of humorous situations based on various dangerous things that aren't taken very seriously, whether it's from the town doctor's obliviousness to the fact there's a dead body on the ground, or the opening where the captain is dragging Harry's corpse when a woman asks him nonchalantly, "What seems to be the trouble, Captain?" Hitchcock later claimed that was his favorite line in all of his features. It perfectly captures the pride and sweetness of the film, the British sensibility as Hitchcock called it. This is a movie that is first and foremost about character. In an intentional pull on his part, it's a rare Hitchcock movie from the era to not feature any big stars. So instead of the little town the film is set in and its inhabitants take center stage, there's a surprising recurring sense of comical dread, be it the motif of the closet closing and shutting, signifying guilt, or just a general attitude about how they go about burying the body. But the primary relationship is centered around the romance between John Forsythe's artist Sam and Shirley MacLaine as Harry's estranged wife Jennifer. Blossoming romance between the two is quite nice. It's where many of the film's quieter moments tend to shine. At one point, Sam tells Jennifer that he'd like to paint a portrait of her nude, though the dialogue by frequent Hitchcock collaborator John Michael Hayes is very outdated. For the time, this was considered risque and shocking. MacLaine was a struggling Broadway chorus girl when Hitchcock discovered her for the film. She's sparklingly delightful in her debut. The Trouble with Harry may not be a top-tier Hitchcock, but it's a good example of him pushing his dark, sweet humor to great effect. Definitely a feature worth seeking out. Released in 1953. Based on a 1902 French play by Paul Thème, I Confess is Alfred Hitchcock's attempt at a religious-themed film, but in classic Hitchcock form, It's a priest film masquerading as a wrong man crime drama. Montgomery Clift stars as Father Michael William Logan, a reverend who gets a visit from a man who confesses to murdering someone. When the police come to confront Logan, he cannot reveal the truth because of the confession, leading the police to start suspecting him of the crime. It may seem on paper and at first glance that I Confess is another long-line Alfred Hitchcock assembly line accusation dramas, but there are a number of things that help to make it stand out from other Hitchcock films. The movie was shot on location in Quebec. The film takes advantage of its French-Canadian setting, showcasing the city landscapes and interiors of the church. Hitchcock was raised Catholic, and the material had spoken to him personally. He wanted the film to be as authentic as possible. Initially, the film was going to have a story involving a legitimate child, and the priest was to die at the end. But of course, this being the 1950s, the production code was never going to go for that, so it got scrapped. The movie is full of striking religious imagery that is not only visually stirring, but also very relevant to the story. The way Hitchcock shoots the church in black and white makes it stand out as almost feeling menacing. Walking is also an important part of the narrative, as Hitchcock uses it symbolically here. It's where Father Logan's guilt comes to play, and we see bad things befall him constantly. At one point, 2 French-Canadian girls are called in for questioning by the authorities. And we see narrative perspective played with, as the exact same shot is repurposed from a different viewpoint in order to seed doubt on Father Logan's testimony. Half the movie plays like a procedural, while the other half plays like a doomed romance. Carl Malden plays one of Hitchcock's more serious law authorities, an actual confident officer of law who takes charge and does not let fate decide his actions. In comparison, the romantic parts are far more developed than usually are in these types of Hitchcock man has done no wrong pictures. This isn't a case of 2 attractive movie stars getting together because they're in a situation where they're expected to. The relationship between Logan and the woman he lost, Anne Baxter's Ruth, is generally presented as complicated. In flashback sequences, via an interrogation, we get the perspective of Michael and Ruth's love story from Ruth's own point of view, how they met, how the war changed their relationship, and how they ultimately drifted apart. Unusual for Hitchcock, the flashbacks are incredibly dreamy, almost romantic-like, and just like in Stage Fright, there's a sense that Ruth is playing live perception on what their life together was actually like. It is not all that common for a Hitchcock movie to have this much time to develop the internal relationship of a romance, and it is refreshing how much perspective he and screenwriters George Barry and William Archibald give these characters. Reportedly, there was actually a cut 2.5-minute kiss scene between the two that was thrown out because of Quebec censorship. Hitchcock was so upset, he swore to never set foot in the city again. This all climaxes with a confrontation with the killer in a cathedral. Most Hitchcock murderers are generally vile people who kill simply because they can. This is the rare one who, while not being forgiven for his sins, we can understand his madness and desperation. There is a level of underlying tragedy in the way he realizes his mistakes, and then ultimately perishes because of his own actions. Some people have criticized Montgomery Clift's performance for being too bland or stiff, but given the kind of character he's supposed to be, a reserved priest, it actually makes sense that he'd be incredibly aloof or low as a person. It is not a perfect movie, and it probably suffers as a whole from a lack of humor. This is a somber story of trust in one's own judgment of fate. There is no place for witty banter. The mood just doesn't allow for it. While Hitchcock movies have moments of relief or great one-liners, I Confess plays it about as straight as possible. It is not Hitchcock's best film, but it might be his most unapologetically symbolic. Released in 1976, and based on the novel The Rainbird Pattern by Victor Canning, Family Plot is the grand finale to Hitchcock's long career. Barbara Harris stars as Madame Blanche, a fake psychic who cons people out of their fortunes. She and her boyfriend assistant actor George, played by Bruce Stern, run across a pair of serial kidnappers, Fran and Arthur, Karen Black and William Devine, while trailing a missing heir in California. Family Plot is notable as being Hitchcock's last feature, and in that context, it's a very disappointing conclusion for the master filmmaker. Coming off the much more memorable and seeing his return to form Frenzy, Family Plot feels almost quaint, very TV movie-ish in comparison, but with 40 plus years of hindsight, and removed from the context of being the finale of his career, Family Plot is a very fun murder mystery tale. None of Hitchcock's big directorial tricks are on display here. The only exciting set piece in the film is a bizarrely edited car chase, and a lot of the movie moves at a leisure pace, with a plot that atypical of Hitchcock is actually very simple and straightforward. What I think I appreciate about Family Plot is how stripped of basics it feels. Following a string of very gripping or serious thrillers, Family Plot sees Hitchcock going back to more of a black comedy, lighthearted route, complete with a whimsical sounding John Williams score. The movie is largely self-contained and features 4 primary central characters. The chemistry of the cast is part of the reason the movie works as well as it does. The studio initially envisioned big stars like Jack Nicholson and Liza Minnelli as the leads, but Hitchcock didn't want to overpay salaries. Instead, he had to settle on what I would affectionately call the B-team as our leads. This much lower stakes of a level cast turns out to be one of the film's saving graces, as all of the actors are well suited to the parts that they are playing. Barbara Harris and Bruce Dern are our central protagonists, as Blanche and George. They are being pursued by our villains Karen Black's Fran and William Devine's Arthur. The film's entertainment value comes from watching these actors play off each other. The movie regularly cross-cuts between these 2 different stories, eventually culminating in the big confrontation at the end, where all 4 of them meet for real. It is an almost labyrinthian constructed finale, where Hitch sets up one big trap after another. Hitchcock and screenwriter Ernest Liam managed to find the absurdity in the idea of murder being fun. Like The Trouble with Harry before it, this is a movie about a very serious situation that is taken as non-literally as possible, and that is where the entertainment comes from. Death is often treated humorously. The main antagonist's poison attempts are shown off in a very dark, almost absurdist way. George digs around a gravesite in order to get information and nearly trips on a tomb. Maloney, the paid assassin who's been chasing Blanche and George throughout the film, ends up meeting his demise when he accidentally gets hit by a bunch of teenagers driving by. Maybe the best example of the movie's lightheartedness, and the part that I'll admit to enjoying the most, involves a montage of Blanche looking for Arthur. She finds the right initials, but because of her not reading the full name, keeps running in the wrong person again and again. This is not meant to be one of Hitchcock's more psychological or dramatic thrillers. It's a fine little divergence from a director who is clearly in the mood to do something a bit different for a change. While it might seem anticlimactic that Hitchcock ended on such a light note, Family Plot is far from routine. Released in 1943, Shadow of a Doubt stars Teresa Wright as young Charlie, a good perfect girl who is anticipating the arrival of Uncle Charlie, played by Joseph Cotton, a man she was not only named after, but also looks up to. After Uncle Charlie arrives, strange things start to befall the family. As young Charlie begins to connect the dots, she comes to the realization that Uncle may not be all that he appears to be. Uncle Charlie may in fact be a notorious murderer wanted by the law. Now, it might seem strange that I'm putting this on my underrated Hitchcock list. After all, isn't this movie in the National Film Registry? Didn't Roger Ebert include it in a series of articles about great movies? Plus, not to mention the fact that it's talked about in the context of being Hitchcock's favorite film. Well, yes, but also I feel even with that acclaim, compared to other bigger Hitchcock films, people kind of forget about Shadow of a Doubt. Rediscovering this masterpiece is never a bad thing. Based on a story by Gordon MacDonald, one of the editors at Universal at the time, Shadow of a Doubt sees Hitchcock's own take on small-town America. Hitchcock and screenwriter-playwright Thornton Wilder decide to have a movie's small-town location take place in Santa Rosa, California. Hitchcock had already explored the idea of someone close to you being a murderer with suspicion, whereas that film seemed to be leading to an explosive end, and instead went out with a whimper. Shadow of a Doubt is that very same concept, but taken to its extremes and within the confines of an ordinary family, it actually delivers on its promise. Teresa Wright is terrific here as a seemingly all-too-perfect teenager whose fear begins to grow larger and larger. The family that Charlie comes from is the embodiment of the average U.S. family. A loving mother, a hard-working father, 2 younger children that are wise beyond their years, maybe too wise. Their lives are upended by Uncle Charlie, who everyone seems to refer to lovingly, but as it turns out, is secretly the black sheep of the family, a fugitive on the run, hiding out. It's Joseph Cotton as Uncle Charlie, who steals the show, playing a man who hates the world and the people around him. In typical Hitchcock fashion, he never lets the audience stray from the idea that Uncle Charlie isn't actually the villain. There are so many blatant clues and hints as to his real nature. From the opening scene where Charlie's seen lying in bed smoking a cigar, when his landlady tells him that two people are here to see him, the fact that he's accompanied by sinister black smoke when he gets off the train, to the way Hitchcock shoots disturbing close-ups of Uncle Charlie's face. And the movie keeps cutting nightmarish visions of what we assume are widows waltzing. Not to mention the way Hitchcock uses his love of stair scenes to frame Uncle Charlie in such a way that it comes off like walking evil incarnate. There's never not an idea that this seemingly lovable uncle is actually up to no good. Perhaps the biggest indication, though, that Uncle Charlie's messed up in the head is this little exchange he gives at the dinner table.
Horrible. Faded, fat, greedy women.
Doesn't sound like something you hear from a nice uncle, unless you know he was actually a killer. This movie wound up becoming close to Hitchcock's heart, which is part of the reason why he considered it his favorite movie. His mother, Emma Hitchcock, was dying, and because World War II was happening at the time filming had begun, he was unable to visit her. It is said that the mother, in Shadow of a Doubt, played by Patricia Cullinch, took a lot of characterizations of Hitchcock's real-life one, right down to her name being Emma. The story is not perfect when you break it down. I mean, who'd actually believe that cops, disguised as photographers, would be able to trick people into getting their house that easily? The movie tries to have romance between young Charlie and a handsome officer played by MacDonald Carey. Doesn't really contribute anything major to the actual structure of the plot. But Hitchcock movies have never been about complete logic. It's a combination of directing, performances, and incredible suspense. And as far as suspense is concerned, Shadow of a Doubt is a 10. Lifeboat stars a group of survivors of a U-boat attack who find themselves stranded in the middle of the ocean. They have to work together or else they'll perish. Hitchcock conceived the idea of a World War II movie set in a lifeboat as a way to reveal the complexities and metaphors of the war, and also the technical challenge to shoot a movie entirely within the confines of a small moving set. He initially considered Ernest Hemingway to write the script, but eventually settled on John Steinbeck. By all accounts, Steinbeck and Hitchcock did not get along, and much of his script was rewritten by screenwriter Joe Swerling. Steinbeck later asked for his name to be removed, citing the fact that he had issues with the film's supposed anti-labor message and the character of Joe. I can't say he's wrong, but context is very important. Steinbeck gets a story by credit instead. In a case of history repeating itself, shooting the water proved to be a bad idea from a production standpoint. Getting in and out of water tank regularly caused the cast to come down with colds, fevers, and all sorts of other dangerous diseases. These massive production issues aside, Lifeboat is a marvelous experiment. It is less about the war and more about personal crisis in a time of danger. The movie is populated by a group of diverging characters, from a wealthy columnist played by Tallulah Bankhead, to a suspicious German played by Walter Slezak, to a miserable desperate drunk portrayed by William Bendix. The movie's greatness comes from these characters interacting with each other and watching as they continue to lose their minds, while trapped on a seemingly ultimately doomed destination. One bad incident befalls them after another. They lose a lot of their major equipment, their food gets washed away after a rainstorm. Worst of all, the German they have on board, Willie, is revealed to be a Nazi spy, and in one of the film's most intense, dangerous moments, pushes Gus overboard to his death. Hitchcock shoots for a bit of a quasi-realistic vibe. Everybody looks grim, dirty, and miserable throughout the picture, save for Tallulah Bankhead's Connie, who Hitchcock cast because he wanted to imagine what it would be like if a person looked like that was trapped in this type of scenario. Think of the way he shoots her in the opening scene. Almost positively perfect. This makes it all the more ironically amusing when she goes a bit crazy from having to deal with losing her precious items. There's a bit of a commentary going on here on the differences between upper class and lower class people. Every character has a backstory that gets brought up again and again throughout the film. Alice, the young woman, talks about the man she's having an affair with, or Gus brings up his wife back home. It's all these surprisingly personal, revealing character moments that make this film a worthwhile endeavor. The way Hitchcock uses the camera here is genius. Constant intense shots on people's faces, where you can see the sowing of their distrust start to build up over time. There are also incredible rainfall sequences, where you can see our main characters getting absolutely drenched. This is boosted by a lack of a diegetic music score, where the main thing you hear in the background is the eerie sounds of the wind blowing. While the movie does end on the required old-time happy ending, it still has the courtesy to go out with a climactic set piece, where a lifeboat having reached its proposed rescue station finds itself getting caught next to a battling warship. This harrowing sequence was the most expensive part of the feature, and it's the closest thing the film has to a direct, non-earthly bit of action, as our protagonists have to duck or get killed, all the while they have the additional problem of another German climbing aboard their vessel. Lifeboat is an Alfred Hitchcock film that was incredibly topical back in 1994. It received criticism at the time for its positive portrayal of the German U-boat captain, which if you watch the movie now kind of baffles me, because while he's given a lot of dignity, he still does a horrible thing and gets punished for it. It also got Hitchcock one of his 5 Oscar nominations for Best Director. The movie may be rough sledding as an actual film, but the trip getting there is definitely worth the viewing experience. Plus, given the setting, Hitchcock's cameo might be his most clever. Released in 1956, The Wrong Man stars Henry Fonda as Christopher Emmanuel Manny Ballinstro, a real-life New York City jazz player. One night while walking home, Manny is confronted by some police officers who bring him in for questioning. As it turns out, a bank robber has been going around the city, stealing from people, and he has an eerie resemblance to Manny. It only makes sense that Alfred Hitchcock would make a movie called The Wrong Man. In fact, his own autobiography probably could have been titled The Wrong Man. But The Wrong Man stands out among all the other men accused of a crime Hitchcock movies because unlike the other films in this so-called mini-genre, this is a movie that has a basis of reality. Instead of making his obligatory cameo, Hitchcock's appearance in the film is unusual as himself in the intro, explaining it's unlike any film he's made before because of the fact-based nature of it all. The Wrong Man spurred out of Hitchcock's interest in wanting to direct a documentary when he heard about the real-life crazy story of how Christopher Emmanuel Ballinstro was mistaken for a thief and his wife ended up suffering a nervous breakdown because of it. He knew this was the best chance he had at making a movie that was as much based in the real world as possible. He traded his usual striking color at the time for a more gritty black and white, and decided to shoot the movie on location in New York City. To paraphrase the usual cliche talking point, the city of New York is almost as much of a main character as Manny is in The Wrong Man, taking inspiration from popular Italian neorealism of the 40s and 50s. Hitchcock, who shot the movie using actual locations that were used in the real case, creates an incredible striking reinterpretation of 1950s New York. Henry Fonda is terrific as an innocent man who finds himself in a very particular bad situation. The movie does a great job of establishing Manny before he gets taken into custody as being both a loving father and also a loving husband. As Manny's worries begin to grow that the case may not go in his favor, so does Fonda's acting, bringing doubt and fear to the part of a man who just wants to be free. It's a tricky balance, and Fonda is there to bring out the clear good person in Manny. Vera Miles also brings great support as his wife Rose. Hitchcock wanted to make Vera Miles into a star, and this is the movie they did before Psycho. As it becomes clearer and clearer that Manny will go to prison, and all the witnesses have seemingly somehow coincidentally died, Rose reclines getting depressed and eventually checks herself into a sanitarium. It's a hard role to swallow, and in the wrong hands, it could be done horribly wrong. But Miles does an incredibly admirable job of restraining herself. Rose is clearly still human. There is, however, a very slight feeling that the movie sidelines her a bit by the end. Hitchcock does some incredible perspective directing here. Anytime Manny enters a store in the first act of the film, there are clear close-up shots of the clerks who work there, as to create the mood of uneasiness, like these people have seen this man before, and they know he means bad business. And the cell sequence, oh my god, if there's any moment of the film that'll stick in your brain, it's the scene where Manny goes to prison. The close-up of Henry Fonda's worried face, the fact that the camera is in a constant flux of motion, Bernard Herrmann's dark score, the spinning effect that makes it all look like a nightmare. Hitchcock has directed plenty of terrifying moments in his career, but this might genuinely be the scariest of them all. At the time, the movie was dismissed and ignored. Too many people saw it as being too serious, too stern, that ends on too much of a happy note. They viewed it as a minor Hitchcock. Even he didn't seem to think of it much himself, as he told Truffaut, but I think in the context of all the Alfred Hitchcock Wrong Man films, The Wrong Man might be his best.